Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine, messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, July 20th, 2024. We commence with our sister, Luyanda Kuboka, and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. For today's program, our central theme for this hour focuses on slavery and how it is archived. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Laura Helton, assistant professor of English and history at the University of Delaware, here to discuss her new book titled Scattered and Fugitive Things: How Black Collectors Created Archives and Remade History. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Robert Colby, assistant professor of history at the University of Mississippi, here to discuss his book, An Unholy Traffic: Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Miles Davis, prison radio commentaries from Mumia Abu Jamal on conspiracy theories and the Biden Redux. We also have more music from Keith Jarrett, Louis Hayes, Bobby Hutcherson, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Buenos dias. This is Sister Luyanda Kuboka with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, with critical dates and events in humanity's struggle against the greedy profiteers of the imperialist nations. July 18th, 1964. The Whites' rebellion breaks out over the issue of police brutality against African men, but was the tip of the iceberg of African people's frustration with the racist structure of the U.S. government. The Watts Rebellion and the subsequent rebellions and the Black Power movement throughout the United States ushered in an era of appeasement, with Africans in the United States being given access to European universities, jobs, military, non-profit funding, housing, and much more, all in an effort by the ruling class to co-opt the potential revolutionary growing consciousness of the masses. They also wanted to demonstrate to the world, and especially the newly emerging African and Caribbean countries, that the U.S. was removing the old shackles of segregation and ushering a new era of integration. The U.S. was competing with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics for ideological hegemony throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. July 18, 1936. The start of the Spanish Civil War, which by many was considered the most important social revolution in Europe of the 20th century. Workers organized self-managed factories and peasants organized voluntary collectivization of villages and farms. This was the first European war against fascism, which would come to characterize Germany and Italy and lead to World War II. Many anti-fascists of all nationalities in the spirit of internationalism joined the ranks of anti-fascists in the civil war against General Francisco Franco, who overthrew the democratically elected Republican government. The fascists included the landed elites, the urban bourgeois, the Roman Catholic Church, and other conservatives who fully supported the rise of fascist state of Spain. July 19, 1928. Nwanyeruwu, led by Aba rebellions of 1928 in Nigeria. Nwanyeruwu, together with a cadre of women, forced the British colonialists to abolish a tax they had wanted to impose on women for being women. Their actions sparked continued anti-British agitation. July 19, 1979. The Sandinistas, a mass-based Latin American movement to liberate Nicaragua from the fascist Somoza dictatorship, which the United States, the CIA, and multinational corporations had propped up for more than 30 years, ascends to power, providing social programs and economic reforms that uplifts the quality of life for the workers, peasants, and indigenous people of Nicaragua. July 20th, 1925. Frantz Fanon, an African born in Martinique in the Caribbean, was born. He was educated at the Sorbonne of France in psychology and became a leading Pan-African militant in the National Liberation Front of Algeria, which led to the Algerian Revolution against French colonialism. He authored numerous books on the psychology of oppressed versus the oppressor, including The Wretched of the Earth, a mandatory reading for the Black Panther Party, SNCC, and numerous revolutionary movements throughout the world. July 21st, 1967. Albert Lutuli, author of Let My People Go, the autobiography of a leading African National Congress traditional chief who leads the struggle for freedom from the racist South African regime. July 21st, 1982. The settler colonial Zionist state of Israel invades Lebanon in a feeble attempt to destroy the PLO and the Lebanese resistance movement. Tonight, we interview one of the foremost experts on Zionism and the relationship to Lebanon and the United States. July 22nd, 17th century. Awashanks, a Native American woman warrior who fought the English to a standstill based upon a Native American confederation to repeal all whites from the native lands. July 22nd, 1796. 600 freed Maroons immigrate to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, from Jamaica in an effort to establish a free society. July 23, 1952, Egypt breaks from the British neo-colonial regime of King Farouk, and state power is seized by the secret society of dissidents known as the Free Officers Committee, headed by Gamal Abdel Nasser. This signifies the return of Egypt, or Kemet, to its independent status as a free African state devoid of European control. July 23rd, 1892. His Majesty Haile Selassie Jah was born. Haile Selassie, the last emperor of ancient Ethiopia, was the leader of African resistance to colonialism, hence has become the god of living truth for the Rastafarian movement and a central reoccurring theme in reggae music and among all Pan-Africanists. Ethiopia, the birthplace of all humanity, the first Christian state, the only country in Africa not to be successfully colonized during the European terrorist assault upon Africa, is the most mentioned country in the Bible, whether said to be Cush, Abyssinia, or Ethiopia. July 24th, 1914. Marcus Mosiah Garvey begins organizing the Universal Negro Improvement Association, an African Community League in Jamaica, to become the largest black organization worldwide up to and including today. Its slogan, Africa for the Africans, becomes the war cry for over 53 African nations fighting colonialization. This has been Freedom Now's weekly historical component here at KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, Southern California, always streaming live worldwide on the web at kpfk.org. So please join us wherever you are, in the words of those on the motherland and in the diaspora, as we chant Amandla, which means power, and the response is Awetu, which means is ours. The power is ours. Amandla,
Awetu.
Amandla,
Awetu.
Amandla,
Awetu.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Laura Helton, Assistant Professor of English and History at the University of Delaware, and author of the book Scattered and Fugitive Things, How Black Collectors Created Archives and Remade History. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Helton.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to join you today.
And we're glad you decided to join us. So, why did you write this book?
Well, this book began for me, the thinking for the book 20 years ago. I started my career as an archivist of social movements. I worked at the Tamiment Library in New York, which documents the history of the American labor movement and American radicalism. And then I worked on a statewide civil rights history project in Mississippi. And I learned so much from doing that work, and those were the seeds of this project. I learned day in and day out that history is urgent and contested in the present. In Mississippi, we were not just filing away dusty old boxes of history that wasn't relevant to the history. This was the early 2000s, the 40th anniversary of many of the major kind of events of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. And there was a battle raging over how that civil rights history should be remembered, how it should be taught in schools. And really, we're still in that battle today. And if the history of the Black freedom struggle didn't matter, there wouldn't be so many people trying to keep students from learning it or from finding it in their libraries. I also learned when I was working as an archivist that every social movement has its resident documentarians, the people who are taking the minutes, taking the photographs, saving the flyers and ephemera from a rally or a protest, building the libraries. And that's how we have a record of grassroots movements. It's because of the activist archivists who are both in the movement, they're of the movement, but they're also its record keepers. So what that work, doing that work as an archivist of social movements, taught me also is that libraries and archives and collections aren't just the places that you go to research a story. Each collection and how it came to be and who built it is a story in its own right, and I wanted to tell that story. That's really where this book began.
I see. Now, speaking of which, many in our audience are probably familiar with the premier Black library that is cited in Harlem, speaking of the Schomburg, which carries the name of Arturo Schomburg. Who was he and how does he figure into your book?
Arturo Schomburg was an early 20th century Afro-Puerto Rican intellectual and a key figure in what was then called the Negro History Movement. He was born in 1874 in San Juan, and he spent his childhood back and forth between Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, but migrated to New York City in 1891. And in New York, he joined an expatriate movement against Spanish imperialism. He was just in his late teens in that decade, but he was already literary minded, and many of the earliest books that he collected are from that revolutionary moment. So essays and poems by the Afro-Cuban independence icon Rafael Serra, for example. After 1898, when the US intervened in Cuba, Schomburg stayed in New York and then found a second community of self-taught intellectuals who gathered around the Black nationalist journalist John Edward Bruce, who was known as Bruce Grit. And Schomburg and Bruce shared a love of poetry, and Bruce encouraged the young bibliophile Schomburg to keep collecting. So Schomburg spent the first 2 decades of the 20th century collecting books, pamphlets, sermons, manifestos, anything he could find that documented the history of the African diaspora. So much so that by 1926, his library was overflowing his family's row house in Brooklyn. And he sold his collection to the New York Public Library at the height of the Harlem Renaissance. And that's why his name is so familiar and he's such a famous figure. He's really the African diaspora's most famous bibliophile, is because his collection went at that moment to one of the premier libraries in the US. And it's now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. At the time, there were about 4,000 or so items in Schomburg's library, and now the collection around his has grown to over 11 million items. So it is indeed the cornerstone for Black Studies research in the US.
Well, full disclosure, I should confess that my personal archive, my papers are at the Schomburg in Harlem as well. Now, who was Alexander Gumby?
Alexander Gumby was a fellow Harlemite of Schomburg. They knew each other. They crossed paths from time to time. So he was also active in the early 20th century, like Schomburg. But he was of a very different milieu. He had been born in Maryland and came north at the turn of the century as a young man, really found his way as a young New Yorker. And he was part of a working class, not so underground gay scene in 1920s Harlem. And although he loved, like Schomburg, collecting rare books, what he's most known for are his scrapbooks. He was collecting ephemera. He was collecting every little thing of Black life going on around him. So ticket stubs, the programs to a boxing match, calling cards, newspaper clippings, everything that he could get his hands on, and organizing it in these very elaborate scrapbooks that he kept. He called it a history of the Negro in scrapbooks. And he kept them in what he called the Gumby Book Studio in Harlem. And in that book studio, he not only displayed his collection of scrapbooks, over 100 scrapbooks on Black life, but also hosted salons where people would gather to talk about Black history and literature and to look at art and hear music and performances. So he was cultivating an archival scene in Harlem in his studio that was a really eclectic group of people, from Greenwich Village and from Harlem. It was a queer, interracial, mixed gender crowd of folks who are often not the names you associate with the Harlem Renaissance. But for Gumby, they were history makers, whether they were the marquee names or not. And so he captures a different register of Black history in those ephemera scrapbooks than the kinds of narratives that you find in the rare books that Schomburg was collecting.
No, if I'm not mistaken, his scrapbooks are now at Columbia University. Is that correct?
They are.
Because I recall using those scrapbooks for various research projects in the past, which brings me to Dorothy Porter, who was, I understand it, has been associated with Howard University, the historically Black college in Washington, D.C. Tell us about her.
Yes, Dorothy Porter was the founding librarian of what is now called the Moreland Spingarn Research Collection. So if the Schomburg Center is really the foundational public library collection for Black studies, Moreland Spingarn Research Center is the, I would say, the foundational key collection among HBCUs. And Dorothy Porter was trained as a librarian and a bibliographer, and she worked at Howard from 1930 to the early 1970s. So she had a 40-year career at Howard and built what was then called the Negro Collection, and which has now grown into the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. Porter is very interesting. She too was part of the scene. She knew Gumby. She was mentored by Schomburg when she was in library school. She worked summers at the 135th Street Branch Library where Schomburg's collection was, and they would spend all day just talking about the books that Schomburg had collected. So she's connected into this scene, but she's really focused on building a collection at Howard University, and she's one of the first Black women trained as a professional librarian. And so she really is a representative of a gendered shift that happens in the history of Black collections. The first couple chapters in my book are about these bookmen, Schomburg and Gumby, who were building collections privately in their homes. But then you start to see a shift in the 1920s and 30s where Black libraries and archives are coming into the care of Black women working as librarians. And so they have to take this long Black intellectual tradition of collecting that's been built by figures like Schomburg and find a system to organize it so that it can be accessible to the broadest possible public. And so she sets about taking the books at Howard that had been donated by Jessie Moreland, another Black bibliophile of Schomburg's generation, and she starts trying to organize them into a library that will be open not just for students and faculty at Howard, but really for a broader public. And what she realizes in the early 1930s is that there was no library classification system that was suitable for a collection of this size and complexity about the history of the African diaspora. This was a moment in the information landscape when very few libraries were paying any attention to Black history. They often ignored it or misfiled it. And so in the Dewey Decimal System, for example, which was how Howard organized its books, like most libraries at the time, there were really only two places in the classification for books about Black subjects. And one of them was the classification number for slavery. And the other was a classification number for about colonies and migration. And it was for the quote unquote Negro question. And that was an incredibly narrow way to think about the scope of Black history. So part of what Porter did then, and really spent 40 years doing, is building information systems for what was not yet called Black Studies, but would soon be called Black Studies, to find ways to organize it and make it accessible and available to people in all its complexity, because she really understood how vast that history was, how vast the knowledge was, and what a disservice other American libraries and information systems had done in the way that they ordered that material. So she's incredibly foundational figure. In some ways has been overlooked, I think, as a Black intellectual, although she's really getting a lot more attention now, and I'm glad to see it.
One of the phrases that resonated with me, Professor Helton, was your invocation of the phrase bookmen, because we recognize that the man given credit for igniting the Haitian Revolution in August 1791 was known as Bookman, and it was an apparent allusion to his being literate and his fondness for books. And I think that there might be a connection between this fondness for books and literacy and the revolutionary processes that begin to unfold in succeeding decades, which then brings us to L.D. Reddick.
Yes.
How does he figure into your story?
So L.D. Reddick so Schomburg, I should say, died rather suddenly in 1938, and his collection was at the New York Public Library in Harlem, and the library needed a successor. They needed a new curator to continue organizing and building that collection. And so here comes a young L.D. Reddick, who had been trained as a historian. He was from Florida. He was a Fisk graduate, had spent time in New Orleans, had taught at Kentucky State University, had done graduate work in Chicago, and here he comes to New York in 1938 and takes over that collection. And so he continues to collect books and material, of course, but he also reimagines the Schomburg collection as this political space. And he's the curator during the World War II years. And so he really makes it a space where both leaders and what he called ordinary men could come together and reimagine the world at this moment when the Double V campaign is going on. So the idea that the U.S. can't just fight for democracy abroad when there is not democracy, racial democracy at home. And so the fight needs to happen on multiple fronts. And Reddick was part of that movement and really made the library a space where people could come together to use the materials that had been gathered in order to imagine a new future.
And of course, he went on to further fame as an advisor and comrade of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Montgomery, Alabama.
Indeed. Reddick is one of those figures that I mentioned earlier, those activist archivist types who are, there's always one in every movement, I think. And so he had that documentarian's impulse. He went from collecting at the Schomburg Center. One of the things he did during the war was to put out a national call for Black soldiers to send the letters that they had written to the Schomburg to be archived, because Reddick fundamentally distrusted the U.S. government to properly document and tell that story. And he goes on to do similar kinds of work in other places. So he moves to Alabama in 1948 and happens to be there at the moment of the Montgomery bus boycott. And he's at every mass meeting taking notes, collecting the materials, building an archive of that movement, becomes an advisor to King, and is the first biographer of King. He wrote a popular biography of King, and then continues on collecting as he goes from one activist moment to another. So he really embodies that activist archivist archetype.
And that brings us to Virginia Lee and Vivian Harsh. What do you have to say about these two individuals?
Virginia Lee may be the name that your listeners are least familiar with, but I think her story is incredible. She was, like Dorothy Porter, in the early generation of Black women who were trained as professional librarians. But she was born in the Jim Crow South and stayed there her whole life, and was the librarian of what was called the colored branch of the Roanoke Public Library. It was the Gainsborough branch. And she began there in the late 20s and stayed for several decades as the librarian there, and had a deep interest in Black history, but of course was working in an environment that was deeply hostile to Black history. And so there was a story that was very famous locally in Roanoke, but not so known outside of it, that at some point in the early 1940s, that white city officials in Roanoke had told Virginia Lee that she had to stop collecting books on Black history and get rid of the collection, or she would lose her job. And what Virginia Lee did in that moment has made her a local hero in Roanoke. She pretended to comply with the order, but did not. She took the collection and hid it in the library's basement and provided secret access secret access to it for some period of time until it was safe to bring the books up from their underground hiding place. And her story is really captures the kind of risk that Black bibliophiles and collectors and librarians were willing to take in order to preserve Black history at a time when the dominant culture often dismissed it or deemed it to be a threat. So I hope that with the book, her story, Virginia Lee's story, will become better known, so that she'll be as known outside of Roanoke as she is there. And the last figure, Vivian Harsh, is actually one of the few women for whom a major Black research collection is named. The Vivian G. Harsh Research Collection at the Chicago Public Library is named for her. And she was the branch librarian of the George Cleveland Hall Branch Library in Chicago, which opened during the Great Depression as a real intellectual home for Southside Chicago. And Vivian Harsh was eulogized later by the Chicago Defender as a historian who never wrote. And what I argue is that she was a historian and was writing history throughout her career as a librarian, but she was doing so in ways that aren't always recognized as intellectual work or as history writing. She was creating book lists and bibliographies. She was creating access to Black history and creating a space where community members could come and have a space for Black study. And so she's a figure who I think really opened up a space for kind of Midwestern Pan-African practice of studying Black history on the South Side.
And the site named for Vivian Harsh is not far distant from where the Chicago White Sox play baseball. And I can personally report that it is a formidable institution indeed. Professor Helton, Assistant Professor of English and History at the University of Delaware, author of the book Scattered and Fugitive Things, How Black Collectors Created Archives and Remade History. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24, South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
And now for our prison radio commentaries.
Biden redux. It's been about 4 years since the last presidential election, and here we are, embedded in a media-fed controversy that borders on the ridiculous. I speak here of the mindless spectacle of Joe Biden's verbal misfires of late. 4 years ago, I wrote that Biden was essentially a gaffe machine, something that anyone who listened to him for over 5 minutes knew instinctively. Now, a media-manufactured crisis states the obvious, almost like blaring that Christmas comes in December. What we know is that Biden stuttered as a child and fought extremely hard to beat it. But in times of stress or nervousness, he stumbles and mixes up words. In truth, it ain't that deep. It's not cognitive so much as it is neurological, as in sparked by nerves. His problems are small compared to his truth-challenged opponent. There are bigger matters at issue here, bigger than the candidates, and bigger than their parties. It's as big as the very climate, fueling storms, floods, hot waves and wind, and even seasons of fire out west. They are harbingers of things to come. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Conspiracy theories. What happens in our minds when something quite unusual happens? Like an assassination attempt occurs? I don't know. But invariably, my mind turns to a movie, such as the Danny Trejo film, Machete, where the muscular Mexican actor portrays a man hired to shoot an openly anti-immigrant politician. When he gets in a position, he finds himself the target of shooting designed to make him the fall guy. In the movie, he escapes to later get vengeance against the plotters. But that's just a movie, right? In the face of the recent shooting of former President Donald Trump, one certainly has reason to wonder. The bizarre spectacle of eyewitnesses calling cops and Secret Service agents to look into sightings of an armed man climbing walls or occupying a roof area over the speaker's platform gives rise to, at the very least, questions. How does such a thing happen? But ultimately, this is not a movie. But guess what? It is a continuing episode of The Trump Show, and it ain't over. Recent events have only galvanized the Trump campaign. It gave a boost like rocket fuel. Now, that ain't a conspiracy theory. It's a fact. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "That which doesn't kill you only makes you stronger." 48 hours ago, the Trump campaign began anew. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Robert K.D. Colby, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Mississippi and author of the book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Robert K.D. Colby.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking to you today.
Ditto. So why did you write this book?
Well, this book came out of my research while I was doing my graduate work. And so it just immediately, it came out of my dissertation. But more broadly, it came out of what seemed like a paradox that I encountered as I was doing research. I knew I was interested in questions of slavery and its practice and experience during the Civil War. And I had also read a great deal about the domestic slave trade. It was something that was receiving a lot of attention in the early 2000s, early 2010s. But the way it was discussed in those books focused predominantly on its antebellum practice, and very few people said anything, or certainly anything extensive about what the slave trade might look like during the Civil War. The assumption seemed to largely be that it would just cease. And yet, as I was looking at records from the Civil War, I kept coming across example after example of predominantly Confederates, but some white Southerners from the border states buying and selling people in what seemed like defiance of economic logic. The slave trade before the Civil War, the forced movement of enslaved people, predominantly from the upper to the lower Souths, had rested heavily on the cotton economy that exploded in the United States beginning in the late 18th century. And the Civil War did enormous damage to that economy. And yet people continued to buy and sell the enslaved. And this was something that I felt I needed to understand and something that needed to be explained.
Now, in reading your book, Professor Colby, it seemed as if there was a tendency of certain slave traders to be, quote, married, unquote, to Negro women. Is that an accurate perception? And if so, do you have any reflection on why that might have occurred?
So I would say that there's actually a great book about this by Alexandra Finley. Alexandra Finley, it's called An Intimate Economy, and she writes about the experiences of several of these women, Corinna Omohundro prominent among them, and Sarah Connor, who was, as you say, quote unquote, married to Theophilus Freeman of 12 Years a Slave fame in New Orleans. And her argument, I think, says a great deal about these women's utility for slave traders in the economy of the slave trade. But certainly there were many, by the time the Civil War dawned, there were many slave traders, particularly in Richmond, who had ongoing, what we might call semi-permanent coerced sexual relationships with women. Robert Lumpkin is the most famous, who ran a jail in Richmond, Silas Omohundro, Hector Davis, several others. And so it certainly would appear that there's a trend of this. I think a lot of it probably has to do with access, but also that these women serve a purpose for them within the slave trade itself. And as I say, I would commend Dr. Finley's book to those, and An Intimate Economy, to those interested in this topic.
Serve what kind of purpose?
Well, they are as I said, they're immediately available. They are, but they're also, I think, can probably be forced to labor in ways that a white woman might not. So as I say, as Dr. Finley has shown, they do an enormous amount of day-to-day work in the functioning of the slave trade. But I think, it also has a great deal to say about power, that they cannot be forced to leave the context of the slave trade, and that it represents, as the slave trade does, the ongoing power of these men over African Americans.
Now, in 1833-34, when Britain was on the verge of abolishing slavery, there was a so-called fire sale, that is to say, the dumping of this property from Bermuda into the Carolinas. You mentioned in your book that in April 1862, when the United States was on the verge of abolishing enslavement in the city of Washington, D.C., there was a similar process of dumping this commodity. And I'm wondering, in 1865 and slightly before, was there a similar trend in terms of enslavers in Florida dumping their property into Cuba or further south into Brazil?
That's a good question. It certainly, as you say, this does take place in a place like Washington, D.C. Elizabeth Blair Lee, who keeps a diary in the city and whose husband is a naval officer, records that many of her, or suggests that many of her friends and neighbors were offloading people ahead of emancipation in Washington, D.C. You also see this happening in the other border states. There is a great deal of shuffling of enslaved people through the slave trade, mostly to stay ahead of sort of the localized emancipation enacted by Union soldiers. In terms of the movement of people outside of the United States during the Civil War, certainly it it certainly happens. I think, for example, of Adam Rothman's book Beyond Freedom's Reach, which talks about the movement and sale of an enslaved woman and her children from New Orleans to Cuba during the Civil War. To the degree that this happens at the close of the war, I've seen relatively little evidence of it. There are certainly rumors of people being purchased and moved to Cuba. Those persist throughout Reconstruction, often in the form of a labor agent promising someone, better wages in one part of the South as opposed to the place in which they're living, and then duping them into sale in Cuba. I think the conditions of the war, however, make it very difficult for slaveholders in the Confederacy to move large numbers of people between the logistical failings in the Confederacy, between the effects of the blockade, which grows increasingly effective as the war moves on. The Lincoln administration, as John Harris has shown, clamps down with increasing effectiveness on American participation in the slave trade. So I've seen relatively little evidence of people being moved from Cuba to Brazil. That's not to say it didn't happen. Certainly, again, as Beyond Freedom's Reach shows, it did. But I've seen relatively little evidence, at least in the sources that I've shown. The number of Confederates who abandoned the South is relatively small. And the sort of ongoing status of slavery in Cuba and Brazil seems somewhat tentative, or tenuous, rather, I think, to some of them. So I've not seen a great deal of evidence. That's not to say, as I say, that it didn't happen, or that Confederates don't go to great lengths to try to avoid the effects of emancipation. I just have not come across many examples of the movement of people to Cuba or Brazil.
Now, we know that during the heyday of enslavement in the so-called Upper South, for example, Virginia, there was this tendency towards, quote, breeding, unquote, or forced coupling of Africans in order to produce this commodity, so-called. And I'm wondering, did that tendency accelerate during the Civil War, particularly in light of the aforementioned blockade that you mentioned, that put a damper on the transatlantic slave trade?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say this is one of those things that exists sort of fleetingly in the archives. I have seen examples of people discussing it in the WPA narratives, for example. What I would say is that I have seen relatively little examples of enslavers sort of explicitly ordering it in the records that I have seen, but the idea they have the fact that enslaved people will reproduce in their minds as they acquire and sell people during the Civil War. I think I was struck as I was doing this research at the number of people who sought to acquire young enslaved women during the Civil War fairly explicitly, with the expectation that they would have children either during or after the war, and that those children would be the property of the person who acquired them. And what I thought was most striking about this is that, this is a war where the survival of the system of slavery hangs in the balance. Increasingly, as the war goes on, the United States is more and more committed to emancipation as a war aim. And yet, well into the Civil War, Confederates acquire young enslaved women with the expectation that they will have children, and acquiring enslaved children themselves. And I think that this is a really telling thing for them to do, in the sense that to put it bluntly, young enslaved women and enslaved children do not have much value during the war itself. Their ability to labor is more limited than of enslaved men, for example. What it tells us is that they expect these people to have value later, in the war's aftermath. And often Confederates say this very explicitly. And so it represents a bet that the Confederacy will ultimately win. and that the people enslaved in the Confederacy will continue to reproduce and to produce more people to be enslaved in the future that Confederates imagine themselves to be building.
Now, it's well known that enslaved property was perhaps the most valuable property in the United States pre-1861. And of course, enslaved property was used as collateral for loans. They were a basis for securitization. And I'm wondering, in terms of current Wall Street lingo, were there those investors who were trying to short this commodity? That is to say, betting on the value falling, particularly, I would say, by 1864.
So certainly there are Confederates, particularly, who are less sanguine, let's say, on the Confederacy's future by 1864. And certainly there are people who do not consider enslaved people a worthwhile or a valuable long-term investment by that point. This tends to be particularly concentrated in areas where Union soldiers are either already occupying the Confederacy or who seem likely to arrive imminently. And so I would say in the sense that wherever the Union Army goes, there is a wave of slave sales precedes them out of that region, which I think you can certainly read as a form of shorting in those places where the Confederacy seems unlikely to retain its authority. Those sales are functionally a bet against the long-term stability of the institution of slavery. I will say I have found examples of people who sell the enslaved prior to the arrival of Union forces, but say something to the effect of, once the Confederacy prevails, we will buy new people. So this isn't always sort of a long-term position, but certainly there are people who sell enslaved people during the Civil War, essentially to prevent them from becoming free. Because when an enslaved person becomes free, all the value stored in that person is lost. Excuse me. So in that sense, yes, I would say you see people shorting enslaved property. There certainly are people who have less long-term faith in its value than others do.
So by 1865, this investment was liquidated without compensation, unlike Britain and Jamaica and Barbados, where London sought to compensate the enslavers, or France and what becomes Haiti, where a kind of reparations was paid to the former enslavers. And I'm wondering, to what extent does this expropriation without compensation to the enslavers help to foment the post-1865 White Terror, to use the title of a well-known book by the late historian Alan Trelease? That is to say, can you draw a connection between expropriation without compensation and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups, for example?
I can't say that I can draw a direct one-to-one correlation, in the sense that I have never seen, for example, a letter from someone saying, I'm sufficiently bitter that I have lost, several $1,000s of human property, and that is why I'm inflicting violence on this person. That said, you do see considerable post-war writings where it becomes clear that white Southerners are well aware of what they've lost. Think of Gertrude Thomas, a Georgia woman who had received enslaved people as a wedding gift from her family, and she is well aware that when the war has concluded, it has erased $30,000 worth of human property that she had expected and sort of hoped to build her life around. And you can see the bitterness in her writing. How that bitterness then translates into violence is a little more opaque. My sense from the records I've read is that it is the violence is more focused on continuing to control enslaved people's labor, rather than to sort of resurrect the value that they had once held, or to sort of refute their increasing political engagement. But to be sure, it's hard to imagine that the erasure of, before the Civil War, enslaved people had been worth $3 billion. That was worth that represented a greater sum than all the investment in banks in the United States, a greater sum than the securities on Wall Street, worth more than the railroads, all the manufacturing capabilities in the nation. You don't have to squint to see what a radical effect this as you say, the erasure of this form of the value of this property would have. I would just say I have not seen sort of a one-to-one correlation between that and acts of violence.
Finally, Professor Colby, author of the book Unholy Traffic, what's next on your research agenda?
Sure. So I'm working on a project that in some ways is inspired by research that I did during this book. One of the things that I was struck by as I was working on this was the ways in which the ongoing survival of the slave trade shaped the choices enslaved people had to make as they decided whether or not to pursue their freedom. It was a really risky choice. We often think and celebrate the hundreds of thousands of people who liberated themselves during the Civil War, but what we I think often fail to remember is that 85% of the people enslaved in the United States remained enslaved at the war's end. And I won't say that the major reason for that is the survival of the domestic slave trade. Geography, I think, certainly has a lot more to do with it. That said, as I was doing my research, I came across example after example of enslaved people who tried to win their freedom, tried to make their way to Union lines, but whom Confederates captured and resold as they tried to do so. And so this was a choice. This was something enslaved people had to weigh. Did they, risk making the bid for freedom, or did they stay put and hope that freedom would eventually come to them? Or, as we said when we were talking about this question of selling short, enslavers often got jittery as the Union Army came close and sold people preemptively before they could run. And so as I was doing this research, I came across a man named William Andrew Jackson, who was enslaved in Richmond. He ran during the Civil War because he got wind that his enslaver was planning to sell him. It turns out, though, that Jackson claimed to have been hired out to work for Jefferson Davis during the Civil War. He turns this into some celebrity in the United States, in the United Kingdom during the Civil War. And so I'm writing about his experiences in slavery, his pursuit of freedom, and his career as an anti-slavery figure both during and after the Civil War.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Colby, author of the book Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Laura Helton, Dr. Robert Colby. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell. Special shout out to Mark Maxwell and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for our sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always we stand ready for revolution.